My son keeps counting down. Now I know what happens at 0. The bullying started when Noah was 5. He was always small for his age, speckled and freckled with a shock of copper hair. He was an easy target. I kept telling him to hit back, to stand his ground. That's what I had done when I was little. But Noah wasn't me. He was gentle and kind. I have to keep reminding myself that. He liked to read and loved to watch Star Trek with me. He was a good kid. It was just a shame no one else could see it. His mom died when he was 8, leaving me as a sole parent. I tried my best, still do, but I'm not his mother. I'm not as gentle or kind, and my smiles don't light up a room. It's hard doing it all alone. He missed her. She left a hole, and no one else can fill it. He came home from school one day and told me he made a friend, Martin. I was happy for him. I thought it would be good for him, and that it would bring him out of his shell. I assumed it was some other kid whose peers deemed him weird, and that they could take comfort in their exile with each other. He'd go to Martin's after school and come back smiling and happy. I was so relieved. Then one day Noah didn't come home. I waited half an hour in the hopes that he was just late and that he'd lost at the time. When he didn't show, I started to get worried. I began wandering the streets looking for him. I knocked half the doors in the neighborhood before I finally called the police. They were worried too, especially when I told them Noah wasn't the kid to stay out all night. He was missing for a total of 2 days. I can't tell you the terror I lived through. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I wandered the streets, shouting his name. All the bullies from his class suddenly found their conscience and helped by posting flyers about the town. Their parents came round with plates of food and offers of help. It takes a tragedy to make people see you, to make them help. Martin never came. You see, when the police went to school to find out Martin's address, they found that there was no Martin in Noah's class. There were only 2 Martins in my small town, in fact. One was a local sex offender, and the other an elderly man up Pinewood Avenue who was bedbound. It goes without saying that I feared the worst. Then they found him. When I got the call, I thought I'd be driving to a mortuary, but they sent me instead to the hospital. I got a speeding ticket trying to get there as quickly as I could. My head was buzzing. What had happened to him? Was he all right? My little Noah. When I arrived, a policeman ambushed. He took me into a relative's room. His face was grave, and I could have wept standing there waiting. We found him in Magnolia, he said. He's completely uninjured. There's no sign of any assault, but he's. Why does there always have to be a but? Why couldn't he have been fine? Why couldn't he have wanted to come home and watch Star Trek with me? My relief died like fire in the rain. He's not responding well. We found him in an abandoned house. He was sitting alone in a room. He had been fed and watered. From all evidence at the scene, there appears to have been no restraints nor any kidnap. We're still investigating. But Noah isn't exactly forthcoming with any information. The doctors are hopeful that your presence might change that. He was in a bed, cross-legged and staring at the ceiling. He didn't even look at me as I entered. Something was wrong. 103, he said in his feeble, in a terrible voice. Sunlight crept in through the blinds and blanketed him in strange bars. 102, Noah? It's Dad. I called out to him. My words didn't seem to reach him. He was in his own world, just counting. 100,001, 100,000, he said. 99, 99, Mr. McMahon? A doctor said. He was old and gray. His face was as grave as a policeman's. I'm Dr. Alderman. I'm a child psychiatrist in charge of your son's care. I have a few questions for you. Firstly, I want to promise you that we are doing all we can to help Noah. Why isn't he speaking? Why is he counting? I asked, does your son have autism or any mental conditions? Is there a history of schizophrenia in your family or his mother's side? He asked, providing me with no information. No autism, no schizophrenia. He's got nothing like that. Why is he like this? What's going on? Please duck. I glanced at him again, still counting away. I looked at my son, Noah. He is eating and drinking. He has no injuries nor any fever. My initial guess was early presenting schizophrenia. Yet, without any family history and his lack of reaction to medication, I find it unlikely. Dr. Alt said, "To be quite honest, Mr. McMahon, I am at a loss. I have called in a colleague of mine from another hospital for a second opinion. I was hopeful he might have reacted to you. While I can rule out any physical assault, I cannot dismiss the possibility of some trauma that has caused Noah's change in behavior. That sicko had hurt him in some way. He might not have laid a hand on him, but he put something in Noah's head. I became sure of it then. Martin. His friend hadn't been some kid from class, but the neighborhood creep who had taken advantage of his loneliness. It wasn't easy leaving Noah in the hospital, but I was too angry to be of any real use to him there. A few of the dads from Noah's class told me where the creep lived. They offered to come along and help, but I didn't want to get them in trouble. This was my burden to bear. I had been such an awful father. I should have known who my son was hanging out with after school. I should have. Mindy would have. He lived in a rundown apartment complex. Graffiti had been scrubbed off the walls, leaving only a thin smear of red and blue. I didn't knock. I plunged his door open, the disgusting loud, and sprawled out on his couch with a rollop between his thin, dried-up lips. Before he could react, my fist went bearing down into his face. The sounds of him grimacing filled me with perverse pleasure. He looked confused and tried to scramble away. "What the? Who are you?" The slime bag said. "Noah's father. What did you do to him?" I punched again and heard his nose breaking. "The 10-year-old boy you've been grooming?" "I ain't been grooming any 10-year-olds. Jesus fuck." He exclaimed, his forearms across his face defensively. I stopped punching. "That missing kid? I told the cops already I ain't got nothing to do with that. I'm on the register, sure. Nothing to do with any kids. I'm not a Christ. It was a misunderstanding with a girlfriend that got me put on. No kids. I swear. I don't have anything to do with your kid. Believe me. Please." His coffee table was stacked with adult magazines. I believed him. I called the police on myself in the end. They were extremely sympathetic, and Martin agreed not to press any charges, though I am pretty sure the stack of cannabis on the table they agreed to overlook in exchange played a part in that. Good guys, the cops in my town. I went back to the hospital. Nothing had changed. He was still counting down. Every hour, the numbers grew smaller. He'd stop to sleep, but when he'd wake, he'd continue the count. 40,603, he said. His voice was changing. The doc said it had to do with the fact he never shut up anymore. His vocal cords were strained and raw. He sounded almost like an old man. My poor little Noah. I couldn't help but wonder what would happen when he got down to 0. Would he stop counting? What would happen when he was finished? I think the doctors were wondering that, too. They were stumped. Never seen a case like Noah before. They kept saying, "Why did it have to be my kid? He'd been through enough. Mindy, the bullying. Why him? I'm sorry, son." I said to him. He didn't look at me. I grabbed his hand, which he pulled back. He used to let me hold him when he was sad. He'd come in from the pool with his bag slumped across his shoulders, and I just hold him as he cried. Not anymore. Noah wasn't in there, and if he was buried deep. I grabbed his hand again. I had Mindy's favorite necklace in my pocket, and I slipped it round his neck. "Help me." I looked to the sky and hoped she was up there. "Maybe you can reach him," I thought quietly. It's my one remaining comfort to imagine that she did. As the cold metal touched his neck, he squeezed my hand. In between mindless numbers, he looked at me. His eyes were wide with terror, like a pig had been slaughtered. "Dad, what's happening to me?" he said. I thought I had him back. The moment died as quickly as it came. The light switched back off, and I was in the dark abyss again, searching the cold nothing for a thread of the sun I loved so much. 39,963. It isn't fair. Life. If God's real, he sure likes giving us more than we can handle. We were getting down at double digits. I was sitting at his bedside, and the doctors had gathered like a swarm. My tragedy was a show to them. They could go home and leave it behind. My head was in my hands. I was scared. I don't know why. My knees hung in the air like a cloud. Something wasn't right. I knew that the son I loved felt further away with every strain number. He was drifting off into the ether, and all my love would go with him. 2019. He said at short intervals. There was jotting on clipboards and nurses that had paused, wordless. It felt like something was going to happen. 1817. I thought about when he was a baby, so tiny I could hold him with one hand. I thought of that first word, so pure and innocent. Duh. I thought about leaving him at school for the first time in his little uniform with a blue blazer and the tears when he came home with mud on his.